Yeah, I'm Jean Huets of Circling Rivers. We publish poetry and nonfiction literature, and I'm with Nina Murray.
Hi, I'm Nina Murray. I'm one of Jean's poetry authors, and I'm very happy to be here today. I'm the author of Alcestis in the Underworld.
So we decided to have a conversation, not about poetry exclusively, but more about the process of being published as a poet and publishing a collection of poetry. And Nina, one of the questions I had for you was, you've been published in journals, you've been published, you had a chapbook from another small press, you've self-published a collection or two, one or two collections now, one collection. What's the difference between all those experiences?
I think the different, and I've heard, I've talked to other people, I've talked to other poets, and as kind of like musicians, we are eager to get our work out there. And I still don't know what the best way to do that is. Mm-hmm. But I will say that having a book, having a full-length collection published really opens doors. So it is important. It is kind of the threshold of having arrived, right? Barring that, having a chapbook is the next best thing. And to me, the difference between the book experience and the chapbook experience had more to do with the difference between editors than the difference on my end. Book, of course, is longer. I mean, there's more work involved. But I've had a range of experiences. The first chapbook editor really was very hands-off, didn't really do very much. You, Jean, were very hands-on. Mm-hmm. Then this was kind of interesting because I had the manuscript kind of in my mind, sort of. I had the group of poems that I thought kind of went together. And I said to somebody, I might have a chapbook. And he said, okay, that's great, just send it to me. And then with a couple of tweaks, went ahead and published that. I've also had a mini chapbook published. I mean, that's so small, it's just staple bound. It's about 9 pages. Oh. But the goal there for what the publisher said was, we want to publish something that can be read in 15 minutes. We want to do this little 15-minute poetry books just to get people to read and not be intimidated. But yeah, I think the bottom line is I just want to get the work out there, and I keep trying things. And I just listened to, and this is going to be my counter question to you, Jean, books versus chapbook versus maybe in the future audiobooks. What do you think?
Yeah, chapbooks, I love chapbooks as things, I really do. As a publisher, I really just want to do collections because I feel like the length of a collection, which isn't super long, most collections run maybe 80, 90 pages. Some of them are longer, it depends if it's like collected works or whatever. So it's not like a poetry collection is usually very long, but a full collection, it kind of gives you a lot of room to explore that person's voice and their themes and their, this corny as it might sound, their soul, what kind of keeps them going as in their poetry mode. Chapbooks, from a publishing point of view, there's a kind of a mundane reason I don't like to do chapbooks, which is they don't have spines. So when you put them on a shelf, they're gone. Right, yeah. Who's the Zet, So that, and some book publishers, book sellers will not carry chapbooks. They just won't. The big one, the big chain one that doesn't carry our poetry much anyway. But audio, I have not explored audio now. So in the future, yeah, that's something we might look into. Where I really favor hearing poetry is actually going to a reading and hearing it live, but that's not happening Zoom poetry readings aren't the same, but they're, I've been to some and I've enjoyed them.
I have to say, I don't think I've done a purely Zoom poetry reading. I've done recordings, but it's different because the span of time is less and it's much more packed because I don't feel like I can talk to the audience I can't see.
Yeah.
And so if I pre-record, I just go through a bunch of poems. Sometimes I say something, sometimes I don't, and then that's what happens.
The
So
ones I've seen that work are with several poets, and it's almost like a poetry cafe, but it's on Zoom.
it's going. You said you like collections because they give you a bit more span. As an author, for me, sort of putting the first collection together was intimidating, and I think it's going to be intimidating for every next one. I don't think that's going to change because that scale is pretty large. I fear that I run out of things to say. So the question to you as an editor is kind of when you get a query letter or a sample, however you get submissions, I'm sorry, I don't remember, and then you finally get the manuscript, kind of how can you tell, what do you look for? How can you tell the works?
Well, the queries will have maybe 10 poems or, 10 pages or so. And I don't really, it's kind of hard to talk about because I don't like to criticize other people's works. It's all good. But there's just some things, everybody's got taste, and I like, there are works that I know I want to read more of. So then I ask the author, send me more. And sometimes, I turn them down at that point, and now and then, as you know, I keep going with them. I also, the most recent book we published this spring, Erin Wilson's book, I actually found her on a website that I contribute to, a literary magazine called On the Seawall. So I read her poetry, and I got in touch with her through Ron Slate, who's the one who runs On the Seawall, and we just took it from there. And that's actually a nice way to find somebody. One that's coming out in November by Bernard Horn, Love's Fingerprints. That just came in, he sent it to me. But the collection, collection has such a strong feeling about it. Maybe because I read a lot of fiction. I sort of like, not exactly a story, but a feeling of something that you could stay with for a while that has a continuity. And your collection did, even though it was about different things, and the same with Erin's collection and Bernie's. They range wide, but there is some feeling of going through it. And even if, I read them in order, and I'm very sensitive about the order as an editor, but a lot of people don't read collections in order, and I recognize that, and that's not terrible, but I just like a feeling of something that'll take you a while to finish.
That's interesting, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a story, as in sort of one thing happens and then another thing happens. It's more of a, you try to, when you ask for a reader's attention for that long, for that span, you want to take them on some sort of at least emotional journey, like, because we don't finish in the same place where we started, right? So you want to have some dynamic there.
I don't think many poets write with the idea of like, okay, now I'm writing a collection. This is my third poem in the collection, then I'm going to add this one. When you write poems, and then at some point you feel like you've got enough for a collection. How does that work? How does that come together for you?
Yeah, not very well. When I started to put together the collection, Alcestis in the Underworld, I Googled, like, how do you put together a collection of poetry? That one, I did go into, so I wrote, most of what's in it is written over 2 years that I spent in Moscow. And so as I went into Moscow, I had this expectation, not a rigid one, but sort of for myself I made the intention of write poems while I'm there that would eventually become something that should hold together.
Right.
So it's not that I didn't write them in order, right? Or anything like that, but I would certainly, I think I would choose ideas as I was sort of going around and trying to write stuff. And eventually it became sort of a self-propelled thing because you hit the mode of looking at things, and then you just kind of enter, that becomes your modus operandi. You kind of hit it. And I think anybody who has a regular or in any sort of structured practice will tell you that. The first chapbook that I put together was just chronological, more or less, because it was like, I don't know what I'm doing. So it was 2 years that I spent in Canada, and I just looked at everything that I wrote during that time because there was a theme, you know, it was all, the setting was the same. It was the urban setting in Toronto. There were some themes. There was certainly an atmosphere to a bunch of poems that I thought would hold it together. And then it was interesting as the conversation I was moderating today was with musicians, Bela Fleck and Abigail Washburn, his wife. Bela Fleck of Flecktones, they're banjo musicians. Anyway, so I asked Bela how he got started and sort of how to become famous in music, because he is. And he said, well, you know, you got to play your music to people. And if they like it, that's a good sign. And if they don't, maybe you need to do something differently, right? Wow. And so I remember the first chapbook, I test drove some of the poems, and I read them to an audience that has nothing to do with poetry, and they liked it. So I was like, okay, well, that gave me a little confidence. The second one, the collection was not like that. This one kind of, I think at some point.
Excuse me, what's the title of that one?
It's called Minor Heresies.
Okay.
And I have to say the titles, I have a running document where I put things that I like the way they sound.
Oh.
So they don't necessarily like, there's no, well, Alcestis in the Underworld, that's true, that's the story, that's what we're talking about. But my other titles are just like, I like the sound of that. Mm-hmm. My alternative title for this was Careful While Burning. Oh. And which is a true sign on the side of the road in Pennsylvania. We were driving to Pittsburgh last October, and people were burning leaves. And so what the sign meant was careful while burning. Right. Like, don't set things on fire. But of course,
that's what you want to set on fire.
The beauty of the English language is that it could also mean like, okay, while you are burning yourself, be careful, right?
And so it takes a poet to see that. And you mentioned earlier, and you said, you know, you didn't quite put it this way, but you've sort of, what I discern as sort of a fear of running out of ideas. Do you sort of believe in that, or is that just something you recognize as like, kind of like an actor with stage fright and you just get over when you're on the stage or something?
I'm getting better at trusting that I want. Okay. But it's definitely, I've also had, I joined a poetry postcard festival, which also happens to take place in August. Everything happens in August, I know why. But it's a bunch of people out of Portland. And the challenge is similar. You have to write a poem a day and put it in a postcard and send it to a stranger. So you get a list of 30 addresses, and then you're also on somebody's list. So you also, the idea is you get poems on postcards. And the rules about postcards are flexible. Like you can use the actual, just like the regular size, or you can make your own. So the size is not necessarily the limit, but you have to write every day. So I'm coming off of that right now. I'm almost done, even though it's, I started everything early. So I started early. And I've gone through,
a writer.
I'm a little of a A-type personality, so I'm almost done. But that has been, it's quite liberating. They're short. They go away, and if you never want to see it again, you don't have to. Oh. And if you feel like maybe you do want to see it again, you sort of write it down and it's somewhere, and you keep a copy, and you go with it, but it's definitely an exercise in idea generation. Like you have to say something every day.
Yeah.
And that has helped me in that
But what
regard.
builds your trust when you're working with someone? Because poems, can be very personal, and um, people
I,
can be a little
yeah,
rough with them sometimes.
I have to say, all my editors have been involved to a different degree, but they have all been trustworthy. Like I trusted that everybody, like nobody was trying. And again, I think it's just not worth the editor's time. Like an editor is not going to pick up the work if they quote unquote like don't get it, or if
Okay.
they think they needs to be like radically different.
Okay,
Right.
that's true. Yeah.
Right. So
Very
I
true.
think by the time the editor makes the decision, like I could work with this, there's a fairly high threshold that you've already passed.
Mhm.
Sort of what makes you gravitate. You have to like it.
And I have to feel simpatico with it. Like you said, I have to kind of know what it's about, or at least think that I know what it's about. And so far, the feedback has been yes, that I know, enough of what it's about to work with the poet, on getting it into a good form, as far as being a collection goes. And I just, it's a kind of a question of taste, partly, just the kind of thing that I like versus stuff that other people might like. I tend not to like a prosy type of poetry,
Mm-hmm.
and yet there are prose things that I like a lot. Bernie's
Mm-hmm.
book has his book Love's Fingerprints has um, a section that's called My Father the Swimmer, which is and Tupelo Quarterly published it first. That it's a prose memoir of his father, so it's not even poetry, in the sense of like it's not versified, but it fits so well with the poems as part of the collection, and I liked it, so
Right.
but I tend to like poetry that's a little more it's funny, the word that popped into my mind was destructive of language,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't just follow, that isn't easy to read necessarily. Not difficult for the sake of being difficult, but that challenges me to look at language in a different way.
It has to slow you down, right?
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. I like that. Yes, poetry should slow people down,
It
definitely.
should slow people down because we compress so much. It slows us down when we write it. The
Uh-huh.
first line, I mean, with practice, it becomes natural. Like there is a poetry voice that I hear in my head. And different people are different. The process is different. That's why, I kind of like, you don't like to criticize other people's writing. I don't like to do that. And I don't like to talk about the process because the process is so different for everyone. But,
Yeah.
so I think with that intention of kind of making the time to enter that space, the reason I have to do that is that it's a slow space. You have to pay attention to the language. You have to pay attention to what you're trying to say because you're compressing the thought so much.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the direction in which I go. That the first line that you write may be too prosy, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written my first chapbook has a series of poems in it that are quite prosy, not at all like anything in Alcestis and the Underworld, but I think are perfect. And I dearly love them because they came to me as a set. That's never happened before or since. Like I just got it. And I wrote them. There was one draft for each of them, and they just came out. But they're little stories, and so they're a little bit. They're not as expressionistic as, shall we say, Nina Marie's later stuff.
Okay.
Later work.
Yeah, you have to evolve, right? I mean, you can't just do the same thing.
Well, I want to talk to you about that. That's an interesting point, I think, because I've been thinking about this for a while. I find that I have changed. Obviously, you read different things, you evolve, your voice evolves, you get different teachers, you get different mentors. But I don't see a lot of guidance out there or a lot of conversations being had about sort of thinking of yourself as a changing author.
Mm.
And so question number one for you is, do you, as an editor, look at previous publication record?
Mhm.
Does it matter? Do you have a feeling for when in a poet's career you want to pick them up? Like, do you want somebody who's just starting out? Do you want somebody who has some experience? Is there anything like that as you think about it?
Definitely in the query stage, previous publications will get my attention. If I see that you've been published in some, literary magazines that I've heard of, which, it isn't all inclusive, but, or, some prestigious, then yeah, I admit it'll get my attention. It is not a deal breaker or deal maker.
Mhm.
But it's like the main thing when you're querying is to get people's attention.
Right.
We don't get zillions of queries, but we get a fair number of them. For people who do get zillions of queries, then really just about anything you could do to get their attention without making a fool of yourself, it's excellent. As far as when, we're interested in catching poets, mid-career or beginning or whatever, I honestly could say that it doesn't matter. It really comes down to the poetry itself. I just can't imagine looking at a poet's work and going, well, let's see, they're about mid-career, and it just doesn't figure.
Mm.
You can have fresh voice whether you're, 90 or 20. It just, that's, like I say, that's just not. Now, I will say that if you're a poet who has some community and can say, this poet who everyone's heard of will, endorse my book, that'll get my attention, because that means, number one, it's my chances of getting it reviewed are better. And reviews really help. And number two, the chances of selling it are better, because if people look at a book with a famous poet's name on it, they're more likely to read it. It's just whether we like it or not, that's just the way it is.
Putting myself, I will say the one benefit to having done this for a while, and I've been writing since I did my master's, which was now in double digits years ago, is that you're sitting on a pile of poems, and some of them will pass the cringe test, which is that part where you pull it up and you look at it and you go, or not, or you look at it and you go like, what was wrong with this? Why did they put this? Like, why did they hide this? So whatnot. And so the next time you're putting your books together and you have to hit that 80 pages, you could go back to the stash and pull something from there that didn't ever have a home or didn't fit. And I like that part. I like playing with poems that were kind of, not necessarily homeless, but they weren't written for anything in particular. And then seeing how they fit here, and there, as I'm putting a collection together, if that's what I'm looking at.
But to your second question about, publishing the same poet twice, sure. But for some reason, poets don't like their publishers. We talked about this. Poets are real publisher skippers. They like to skip from publisher to publisher, and I don't know why, but it's your choice. There's a lot of.
I think it's because we think that the more editors look at that, the more editors can sign off on the work, the better you are.
Publishers who are prestigious, and they're going to get you in all the bookstores, and they're going to get you to the festivals, and that I'm like, of course you want to go, because we're not a major publisher. We're not New Directions or Norton or something like that. So, or even a university presses are subsidized and they have more distribution and such. So that I can understand. Definitely aim for the publisher who can get you the furthest. That's the best idea in my opinion.
On my list of questions is there money in publishing poetry?
No. Any other questions? No, there isn't. There's money in publishing poetry, I think, if you're publishing Patti Smith's latest book. of poetry or whatever, sure. For the people like us, the small presses, which are, multitudinous, no, even though I read somewhere, and I can't remember who said this, but they described small presses like Circling Rivers as doing the heavy lifting in the poetry world. Because we're kind of lifting people from zero up as far as we can, and then hopefully they can continue their career and become more well known. And being well known isn't being about being famous. It's about having a lot of people read your work, which is what writers want. You want a lot of people to read your work. That's right. That's what it comes down to. It's not a commercial thing with poetry. The thing about small presses like Circling Rivers is we do take chances on unknown writers. Because known, famous writers are already somewhere else. So that's where, the little guys like us do what they call the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
We are willing to take chances on work that might seem old-fashioned, or work that seems too far out, or too fat, or too thin, or too light, or too heavy, or whatever. We can just do what we want to do and hopefully promote it and get something good going for the work and for the writer, when it's all done.
So how do you get people to read more poetry?
That's a good question. How do you get people to read books at all? Books are really, really hard to sell. Whatever you're selling, whatever kind of book you're selling, they're really, really hard to sell. Any bookseller, writer, publisher will tell you that.
That's why I like this postcard thing, which is kind of silly, but if somebody sends you a postcard in the mail, pretty good chance you're gonna read it. Yes, right? It's small, but it's a piece that somebody sent you, and so it's an object.
Yeah,
it doesn't require a lot of your attention. But me, I'm all about guerrilla tactics. Like, I want my poems on, I want them on wine labels, right? I want
that'd be cool.
Oh, right.
Using whatever you can do to wedge poetry into culture, I think, is kind of what we have to do. Yeah. I think working with people in the community helps. It's everything's changed, because I keep wanting to come back to readings. Everybody's on shutdown now, but whenever they open up, maybe you'll be able to come down and read. We started something going, and then just as we are getting, going, everything stopped. Beyond lyrics to songs, I don't know if poetry will ever really become like super popular. We did have our moment, with now I can't, Ruby Kaur, I think is her name, Milk and Honey, and other people, who kind of blossomed at that time. I got interested in poetry through, mainly through, I'm trying to remember, gosh, it goes back so long ago. I suppose through school, really, when all's said and done. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been forced to read it in school, which I liked, for the most part. Some of it I hated it, but, most of it I liked.
Well, somebody said to me, who is a professional, is a physician, a highly educated person, undergrad in anthropology. She said, I'm a reader, I read books. Not only do I read books, I also read books in a second language just to keep up my language proficiency. Highly educated person. But she said, until I met you, poetry was not part of that repertoire. And it should be.
Yeah.
Just as you watch, shows on Netflix, you pick like the Scandinavian noir as opposed to whatever, right? You go a little bit out there. There's stuff that's kind of, I don't want to say edgy, but not super mainstream, right? And there's something for everybody, of course. There's music, there's such a great variety, and if you listen to some obscure band, nobody's going to look at you funny, right? But if you read poetry, if you read books, people kind of look at you funny. But,
it can be like that, yes.
And so even people who that's why I'm become interested in sort of these professional cultures that cultivate readers.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, and you might have something to say about this, but I think the military is one.
Hmm.
Like the officer corps, most everybody I met reads. They usually read, they read a lot of nonfiction, obviously, but they also read fiction. And then once I introduce them to poetry, they respond really well.
Huh.
They're so happy when they read something and they understand it, and it's just like, where has this been?
We do have to tell each other about it, and we have to tell other people about it. That is word of mouth. It's any bookseller will tell you it's word of mouth.
Yeah.
That's how it starts. Well, it's good talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you very
And,
much.
and keep me in touch with what you're doing, whoever you.
I'll try
Because,
as soon as I figure out what it is.
okay.